Christianity, homosexual marriage, and civil rights. This is a conversation that got sparked on Instagram. It got some weight. Somebody prompted a question. I said I would make a video about it. So this is what it is. The initial post was this. It was a post by Dr. Kevin Young on Twitter. I pulled it, I posted it on Instagram, and then I put a little excerpt at the end myself asking a question. But he said this: every church and pastor should have joined MLK in the fight for civil rights. Agreed. They did not. They were wrong. History remembers. True enough. Every church and pastor should be joining the LGBTQ plus community in the fight for civil rights. They are not. They are wrong. History will remember. What I wrote was I would have joined MLK 100% on civil rights. Absolutely. I will absolutely not support a movement whose greater agenda is to confuse, castrate, and sterilize children. The comment that prompted the video you're watching right now was from this individual. And he said, if we're talking about gay marriage, then the first thing we need to do is define marriage, because Christians and the secular world have a very different way of defining marriage. We can't have meaningful discussion if we are not on the same plane of reality. So Joe, if you want to talk about gay marriage in a future video, do define marriage for us and make your argument from that definition. I have yet to see anybody do this in a public setting. Here you go. A follow-up comment, though. This is from somebody who I greatly respect. And they said this: this is challenging because I wholeheartedly agree, but do we turn them away at the church doors? Obviously, I don't agree with that. If you know anything about me, of course not, we don't. They have a high suicide rate, she continues, domestic abuse, etc. So then what? Again, I do support the biblical view. However, I have a lot of questions. They continue on. I can understand why, as a woman, I wouldn't want to have a male employee try to measure me at Victoria's Secret. It's understandable. But healthcare is different, guys. The true mark of a Christian is love. Agreed. She continues, part of these rights include the right to obtain proper healthcare. I'm going to stop her right there. What is healthcare? That's the problem, is that we're using these terms like healthcare and civil rights. They're good terms, but they're extremely broad. And the problem with things being broad is that in today's world, in today's society, and specifically with the left, in my opinion, is that they use these broad terms and broad paintbrush strokes to lump a bunch of stuff in that most of the world would not agree with or accept in any way. So what is healthcare? Because in a lot of places, what's being argued as healthcare is puberty blockers for kids, surgeries for kids. Is that healthcare? Because if that's healthcare, they should not be able to do that. They should not have the right to do that. However, if healthcare is things that any normal person would need, like having access to a hospital and to doctors and to medical procedures that are necessary, not voluntary, and not based off of the reality, which is that it's a mental disorder, it's a psychological mental disorder to want the kind of healthcare that is putting puberty blockers in little kids and chopping off the boobs of little kids. That is not healthcare. So you would need to define that more specifically. But she goes on to say, as a Christian and a former hospital worker, I could never turn down healthcare to anyone in the LGBTQ community. Agreed. Real healthcare. Real healthcare. Like ever, the best biblical example I can think of is the Good Samaritan. The injured person on the ground was an enemy, which is why others ignored him. Remember that story, please. So the first thing we're going to do is kind of hit the civil rights portion of it, because it's going to be the shorter portion within this specific video. And if you want more depth on it, let me know and I'll do it. But the reason I do not support LGBTQAI civil rights, again, is because it's a very broad term. Do I support general civil rights that everybody else has? 100%, absolutely. I've said it 1,000 times in other videos, even rough ones like drag queens with kids in church and stuff like that, that I don't have a problem with these people. I have no issue with functioning adults choosing to do things that I don't like. Do your thing. Plenty of straight, completely heterosexual Christians who normally people would think that I respect. I don't like how they live their life either. But they're adults and they can make decisions, and that's their right, man. I do think you should have that right. If a dude wants to wear a dress, more power to you. Keep it away from the kids, period. But the problem is because they're trying to lump other things into civil rights. So let's talk about a few of those things. They want the right to teach kids sexual content. We've seen that ad nauseum from coast to coast. You should not have that right. They want the right to free speech about their own sexuality and sexual practices in school to kids. Again, you should not have that right. They want trans canine legality in unions. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, please don't Google it, because it's extremely disturbing. I promise you it's real. And if you really want to know about it, then send me a DM on Twitter or Instagram, and I will link you to a couple of profiles of trans canine individuals who speak very openly about the abuse, in my opinion, of what they do sexually to animals. Should not be legal, should not be a right. You should not have that right. They want the right of forced acceptance of trans ageism, where grown men wear diapers, and we are forced to recognize it as not only real, but also acceptable. You should not have that right. And let me clarify. If you're a grown man and you want to wear a diaper in your house, cool. Where it's a problem is I do not have to accept it. I do not have to pretend like that is real. That's my right. They want the right to remove children from good homes with good parents who simply do not accept that a child's LGBTQ status exists, that they are gender confused and have gender identity disorder. They want the right to child-friendly drag shows. We've now seen, again, ad nauseum, how disgustingly absurd this idea is and how it has been massively abused. And it is completely run by pedophiles. You will never change my mind because I've seen it with my own eyes. Does that mean every drag show is pedophiles and is sexual in nature? No. But does any drag show need to be for children? Again, no. And you should not have the legal right to do drag shows like we've seen in front of children. You should not have that right. We have literal laws that prohibit this, and they're not being enforced. They want the right to let men who identify as women compete in women's sports when this gives them a wild, biologically unfair, and dangerous advantage in many cases over the biological women. Good examples would be the NHL and the UFC. We have now seen with our own eyes in video men dressed as women kicking the crap out of women in sports simply because they feel like a girl. No, you should not have that right. And finally, they want the right to allow grown men into women's restrooms and the right to ignore a woman's rightful discomfort to that situation. And the problem with this is we went from a blurred line to now a completely ignored line, to where not only are men allowed in a women's restroom, but now if a woman or a child expresses discomfort with the situation, they are a bigot and they are in the wrong. You should not have that right. Now, moving on to what we're actually going to talk about is marriage. So the Merriam-Webster definition of marriage is a state of being united as spouses in a consensual and contractual relationship recognized by law. Now, getting into the meat of this, what is the Christian version of marriage? And does it need to be legal? So we're going to hit a few things here. I have some content from a couple different Christian websites. I'm going to read through that, and it's commingled and mixed with some of my own opinions, some of my own interpretations and understandings of biblical times. So it's a mishmash of information. But here we go. Biblical marriage is primarily in reference to Jewish marriage, which is obviously true. Even Jesus primarily noted and referenced Jewish marriage practices when he did speak of these unions. So even when you're looking in the New Testament, most of the references are still in reference to Jewish marriage. So if we're talking about biblical marriage, we're going to predominantly be talking about Jewish marriage. It just is what it is. Marriage in biblical times was not about love in most cases, or at least was not prompted by love. Although in many cases love did progressively become a part of the partnership, marriage was about an actual partnership. Jewish marriages were usually arranged by the fathers of the bride and the groom, and would begin with betrothal or engagement. The bride's and the groom's feelings on the marriage were not usually taken into consideration at all, and it was possible that the bride and groom had never met before. They could have been agreed upon when the couple was very young. In these cases, the engagement would stand until the bride and the groom were old enough to marry. Contrary to practice of many other cultures in which the bride's father would pay the groom's family a dowry, in Jewish culture, the groom's father paid a bride price, or mohar, to the bride's family in order to negotiate the marriage and, in essence, purchase the bride. And that's the reality, man. That's what marriage used to be. The groom would also give a gift to the bride called a matan, which became part of the property the bride would bring into the marriage. So you're purchasing the woman in biblical times, and then the groom would give a gift to the bride that she would then bring into the marriage as a piece of property. So she becomes his property in essence, and then she brings property that was a gift from him into the marriage once it's, consummated. A Jewish betrothal was an important part of the marriage process and was as binding as marriage itself. Those initiating the betrothal and witnessing to the event would likely sign a marriage contract called a ketubah. Therefore, if one or both parties wished to end the partnership, they would be required to get a divorce. We see this in the case of Mary and Joseph, who were pledged to be married. When Mary was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit, Joseph considered divorcing Mary quietly to protect her reputation. That comes out of Matthew 1:18 and 19. However, after an angel visited Joseph in the night, Joseph decided to continue their betrothal process. As a partnership and a couple, Mary and Joseph were essentially husband and wife. Then later married in verse 24, although they did not consummate the marriage until after Jesus was born in verse 25. And finally, in his time on earth, Jesus often used Jewish marriage customs as a beautiful allegory of God's relationship with the church. And I love this concept. I wrote something about it when I was in college. His bride, they called it. Jesus purchased believers with his blood, shed on the cross for the forgiveness of the sins. Acts 20:28, 1 Corinthians 6:19-20, and 11:25. He is currently preparing a place for us, coming from John 14:3, and a future time no one knows, Matthew 24:36. He will return for his bride with a trumpet call and a shout, 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17. The dead in Christ and those alive in him will be taken to heaven, where they will be joined forever with the Lord, Revelation 19:7, and take part in the marriage feast of the Lamb. Verse 9. Marriages today, their meaning, their practice, everything, are extremely different than what was happening in biblical times. So honestly, to compare the two is asinine. Now, should gay marriage be legal? Is it a civil right? Should it be a civil right? And what is kind of my opinion on it? I've got a good amount of stuff here, so if you're still here, good on you. This comes down to whether or not you believe Christians should even be involved in making their religious practices a part of actual law within a country in the first place. I personally am not opposed to gay marriage in the legal sense. I have no problem with it. And this is mostly because I don't put a lot of weight in legal marriage to begin with. So obviously, I'm not going to put a whole bunch of weight in legal marriage for people who are homosexual. Now, I wrote this very specifically, so I'm going to read it. These are my opinions for my belief on marriage and then my belief on marriage with homosexuals. I believe marriage to be a dedication, a commitment, and a bond, an agreement made between two individuals participating in the union before God and including God. This can include a legal contract, but I am a supporter and proponent of non-legal unions as well. Now, my secular belief and gay marriage belief. I believe marriage to be a dedication, a commitment, and a bond, an agreement made between two individuals participating in the union. Again, legal or non, I do not think it matters. What is the difference between the two things I just said? The only difference is that one has before God and including God. Some of you may know if you were here a long time ago. Some of you may not know, especially if you are new. I've been married in the past. I've been divorced. I've now been with the woman I'm with now since my daughter was 1 year old, and she is now going to be 7 this year. But in every way, I am married to this woman. We are not legally married yet. We definitely will get legally married, but as of right now, we are not. But from the bottom of my heart, from the depths of my soul, and before God, I am absolutely married and bonded to this woman. I believe the legal portion to be optional, unnecessary, and honestly risky for many people in today's society, especially for men, which I believe ties into why the rate of marriage has been declining steadily for years. Now, I'm going to read you a couple of statistics. According to the latest data from the National Center of Health Statistics, marriage rates hit an all-time low in 2018, the most recently recorded year. The national marriage rate fell from 6.9 to 6.5 marriages per 1,000 people from 2017 to 2018. This dip was the most noticeable change in a fairly stable trend over the past decade, following a long decline starting in the mid-1980s. As recently as 2001, the national rate was 8.2 marriages per 1,000 people. Now, another statistic to make sense of what I said, especially for men, marriage being risky, this is what I'm kind of bringing it from. A number that has been growing for the past 70 years is the discrepancy between genders filing for divorce. According to Michael J. Rosenfield, PhD, a professor and social demographer at Stanford University, women are more likely to file divorce than men in almost 70% of cases. Then, according to the National Center for Health Statistics, they say that number is modest and it's more like 80% of cases. I want to be extremely clear. There are plenty of men who divorce their wives. There are plenty of men who win the kids in custody. There are plenty of men who take all of the assets. There are plenty of men who are horrible and are doing the same thing here that I'm primarily talking about women doing. The reason I'm focusing on men, it being risky for men and men being in the poor situation, is because it is the greater side of that statistic. But it doesn't downplay the fact that this happens to women as well, and it's equally as horrific. I'm just going off of the statistic. Especially with this concept of no-fault divorce, the risk for a man specifically, due only to that statistic of 78 or 80%. As a man, you have a lot to lose. Still, even though it's changing drastically, I'm fully aware, still in most cases, a man is making more money than the woman. And in most cases, when you have a marriage, a union happen, the man will still continue to be the one who is earning money. Maybe you have kids. The woman will more than likely be the one who spends more time at home. So then when you go through the divorce process, what happens? We have a legal system that weighs heavily in the mother and woman's direction for both assets and the children. So when the divorce happens, the father and husband loses his wife because 70-80% is wife leaving husband. So he's losing his wife. Most of the time, he's losing custody of his kids, at least the majority of it. And in most cases, he is losing an insane amount of assets on top of child support once you factor that in. So marriage has become an extremely risky choice for young men today. And this is why we are seeing young men avoid marriage at all costs. When men are doing a risk to reward in terms of what they want to do with their future and a woman, they're seeing that the risk is not worth the reward. Here's some more statistics to just heighten this. The United States has the 6th highest divorce rate in the world, with that being about 40 or 50% of marriages filing for divorce. The United States Census Bureau reports suggest that marriage and divorce rates dropped from 2009 to 2019. Likely due to the total number of marriages dropping. So that probably makes sense because if you're having less marriages happen, then you're going to have less divorces. But if the divorce rate of marriages that are happening is still 40 to 50%, then you're not actually seeing a decline. You're just seeing a decline in the total number of marriages that are even going through the legal system. Usually, second or third marriages in the United States have a higher divorce rate. 60% of second marriages and about 73% of third marriages end in divorce. This honestly says more about the individuals going into these marriage contracts than it does about anything that has to do with marriage. You're having people who are basically, as you get married more, you get divorced more, which kind of says something about the individual. It says that you are not good at being in a partnership. It says that you are not making proper choices, or maybe that you are not good at compromising, because we all know, those of us who are married, know that that is a essential part of having a relationship last long term. Couples going through their first divorce are around the age of 30 on average, and married couples between the age of 20 to 25 are about 60% less likely to get divorced. So now kind of coming back to where we started, again, if you're still here, good on you. And honestly, if you're still here and you haven't subscribed yet, then I don't know what you're doing, because this has not been the most exciting video in the world and it's been insanely long. So if you're still here, please do that. Hit the like button. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter for more, insanity like this. The comment section gets pretty good sometimes, so it's entertaining at the very least. But coming back to where we started, civil rights, marriage, within homosexuality, LGBTQ, back to the initial question that prompted this entire video. Here, speaking to you directly, here's where I stand on all this. I don't have any problem with homosexuals getting married, because personally, and I know I have an unpopular opinion within Christianity, I don't see anything, necessarily positive about legal marriage under the state in the first place. I just don't see the value in it. I see you get a tax break. That's lovely. But what else is the benefit? So in every way, from the bottom of my heart, I think homosexuals should be allowed to legally get married. I think trans people, adults, should be able to legally get married. I have no problem with that whatsoever. The old joke is that the problem for me, as I discussed earlier, is that we're lumping things into these broad terms like healthcare and like civil rights. What do these things actually mean? If civil rights meant homosexuals being allowed to legally get married and that was it, then I'm all for LGBTQ civil rights. And on that same note, I am one of the Christians that I don't believe our country should be completely mimicking what Christians believe, meaning that I don't think all Christian ideology and ideas should be made law. And again, that might be an unpopular opinion within the Christian sphere, but I don't necessarily believe that. My problem is when we say they should have civil rights, and then that also encompasses my entire list at the beginning of the video, being men in women's restrooms, being men in women's sports, being men being able to go into locker rooms with young girls, being child-friendly drag shows. These things should not be civil rights. So in my opinion, they need to be separated and we need to be more specific. I hope this provided some clarity. If you made it this long, I've got massive love for you. Good for you. You probably just had nothing else to do. I love you and have a wonderful evening.